The reason that you're all here, I'd like to turn this meeting over to Secretary of State Chuck Gray.
Well, it is such a pleasure to be in Weston County, to be in Newcastle. I love Newcastle, love Weston County. We had a very strong return here in the primary and the general election. It's our second best county in the entire state, and really attribute that to the work of those in this room. So many people work so diligently on this campaign, and I want you to know that I wouldn't be where I'm at without you, and know that I'm one of those guys who's not going to forget it. Is not going to forget that I work for you. And on that note, I want to pass around my card. On there is my cell phone. So if you have anything you need 24/7, call, text, whatever you need to do, and I will get back to you. And so thank you for reaching out. I'm a citizen. I was a citizen legislator for 6 years representing East Casper. And when I got to the legislature in 2017, I ran in 2016 and was sworn in 2017. We had 6 conservatives in the state house. 6. And then we went up to 12 in the 2018 election. And then we went up to 18 in 2020. And then this last time around, and it was really a huge moment for our state, we got 28 conservatives in that legislature. We lost a few. We always do lose a few. And we could talk about the tactics that the insiders use. We have 26 solid conservative voting members, and not all of them are members of the Freedom Caucus for whatever reason. Maybe there's a few votes that weren't quite there, or maybe some, for whatever reason, don't want to be in it. I mean, there's a variety of reasons, but we have 26 solid votes there out of 62 in that state legislature. Of course, with the redistricting, one of the things that came out of that was growing the legislature to 62. But 26 is a long way from 6, and we need to continue to work to bring those conservatives in the state legislature. Now, and I know I talked about this on August 2nd of last year at the Pizza Barn when I addressed, a lot of you were there. Why did I decide to run for Secretary of State? Well, Ed dropped out at the last moment. I didn't think being a legislator was forever. I do believe in moving to different things, and whether that's term limits or self-imposed term limits or whatever. I thought immediately when Ed dropped out, I thought this was a great opportunity. Started praying about it, I set a deadline of 48 hours to make a decision because I didn't want the conservatives to split. The filing deadline was ending in a week. You had to make a quick decision. And I came back to a couple of the bills I had worked on in the state legislature. When I got to that legislature, we brought through the ultrasound bill, which was the first pro-life bill in 30 years, was the lead on that bill. And then started working on the voter ID bill. I thought it was outrageous that we didn't have voter ID in this state. Filed it in 2018, we came up short. Filed it in 2019, came up short. Filed it in 2020, came up short. But each time, we made it better. And after that 2020 election, the clerks, the AARP, a lot of the groups that opposed it started coming around at the last month and a half. We had a lot of movement there. So we filed it in 2021 and we got it through. And of course, in that 2022 election, voter ID is the law of the state of Wyoming. And I'm very proud of that statute. Very proud of that statute. And so I came back to that, the work we had done with the county clerks and bringing them along. And I think that we need leadership on election integrity issues because the County Clerks Association, when we first started working on it, were totally opposed to it. And we kept up the dialogue, and that leadership is what ultimately brought them along and what allowed us to bring it through. And I think that leadership is what we needed in the Secretary of State's office and what we need from statewide elected officials who serve on the State Board of Land Commissioners, who serve on the State Loan and Investment Board. We'll talk a little bit as we progress in this talk about how the leadership on those committees has changed policy in just 5 months. So I wanted to, try something different, move into the executive branch, and as the lieutenant governor of the state, there are roles there that I think we needed a conservative to fill. So ran for that. We were successful. Thank you, Weston County, and we've had a really great day here. I want you to know that I will never forget you, and we had a great day. I mean, we started out on the radio show. We started then with the clerk. We met with Clerk Hadlock for a little bit. I think we made some progress there. Then Greg gave us a 2-hour tour of all the State Loan and Investment Board projects that have either been approved or in the pipeline for the city. That culminated with just, I'll never forget that view from Tank 2. Thanks, Greg, for taking us up there. That I'm going to treasure that. And so then we went to a couple meetings out at the Waste District with Mayor Mike, and then went to the hospital district, and then met with some concerned citizens that had addressed a letter to us on election integrity, which actually was the main thing that spurred this trip, in addition to us wanting to do some slip work up here. And here we are now at the town hall, and tomorrow we're going to be up in Upton. Very excited about that as well. Yeah, thank you for the update. When we went into the transition in November and loved, that September 11th memorial ceremony, I've been talking about it all day. I thought that was very powerful and want to thank everyone that put that on. We were in the transition then 2 months later after we were elected there in early November, and one of the first decisions I had to make, and it was providential the way it came together, was who to put on our transition team. And it's an important decision. You have about 60 days here. We were sworn in January 2nd. And with the number of folks that decided not to move forward in our administration, which has worked out fine. I mean, I think having that new energy, we filled almost all our vacancies. We're up 20%, over 20% in our business division. Of course, the media is never going to say that. Or, when I say the media, by the way, I don't mean the local paper here. Bob and the local paper here is not what I call the mainstream media. I'm mainly talking about the Red Star Tribune Pravda on the Platte, as I call them, out of Casper, and then the Tribune Eagle out of Cheyenne. And they're what I call the print media in Wyoming, and they use the same tactics as the New York Crimes, the Wall Street Journal, all those papers over there nationally. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the print media. But one of the first decisions I had to make was who to put on that transition team. And we ended up he's in the back there, Joe Rubino, who became our counsel and our policy director, does great work. And we also put Jesse Naiman, who is an attorney. He was working at the Attorney General's office, and he's a good one, I promise you. He's a conservative that was there. And he ended up becoming our lead deputy. And then the two folks that we added on were Carrie Drost and Nancy McCann from Cheyenne. I want to tell you, Carrie, there were a lot of different moments in those 60 days that we had some inflection points where things could have gone really bad, especially when some of these resignations were happening, and we were trying to communicate with the existing staff, and there were we had to go through some intermediaries. There's a lot of things going on, and Carrie was always just a positive, calming force in the room and a great asset to our transition team. So I just want you to know, in Weston County, you have an amazing chairman of your Republican Party, and thank you, Carrie, for all your service in our transition.
We already knew that.
Yeah, I know.
It was truly my honor to partner with Chuck. You all think as highly of him as I do, so.
One of the decisions we made in that transition was to bring Joe on as our counsel. And there was no counsel in the Secretary of State's office previously, which basically made us very beholden to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General has issued a number of decisions on election integrity issues, which have been counterproductive, in my opinion. So I wanted to try to, there's statutory things that prevent us from doing some things, but I wanted to bifurcate us a little bit from that. We'll talk about later how that played out to our advantage, but bringing Joe in as our counsel was one of the decisions we made that I think played out very positively for us. And we were sworn in January 2nd, and one of the wonderful things, I think it's wonderful, in our state constitution is the way it's drafted. When the statewides are sworn in, you're in session within a week. Actually, 4 years ago, I remember when I was a legislator, it was the day after the governor was sworn in. We actually had a 5-day sort of lead time into the session, and we had prepped for the session during the transition. We had a very successful one. Our number one priority was to end crossover voting. A very troubling practice, the fact that Democrats would go into the polls, switch into the Republican primary, switch back on the way out. It's unacceptable. It was an election integrity issue because our primaries are about the members of our party here, or the Democrat Party, whatever party you're in, selecting who is representative of that party for the general election. That's the function of the primary. And that wasn't happening when you had 15% of the electorate or more, depending on the cycle, churning in to the primary. So that was our number one priority, to end that practice. And this wasn't some low degree of difficulty deal. I mean, every year I had been a legislator, 6 years, we had tried to get that through. We hadn't been able to get it done, partially because the Secretary of State's office at the time was either counterproductive to that effort or lukewarm. I could go back, think of Ed Murray or even Ed Buchanan. Their heart wasn't in it. And we made a number of strategic choices that I think were very helpful in bringing that through. One was bringing that bill through the House. We had tried to bring it through the Senate 4 of those 6 times. Boy, I think back on some of those. I mean, there was a couple times we tried both. And it had always gotten either log jammed in the Senate, or if it got through the Senate, then the House would stop it. And there were a number of reasons strategically to try to bring that in the House. So I asked Jeremy Haroldson, who is a friend of mine. He served, this is his 3rd year in the legislature, actually stayed with me there in Cheyenne, and asked him to bring the bill in the session, and he did. And the Senate bill ended up failing, but the fact that we had a House vehicle that passed 51-9 over there, and usually when a bill passes by that margin that is a landmark bill, that usually means there's an understanding in the other house that it's going to fail. So we had a backup plan, which is if it failed in committee, which it did end up failing in committee, we were going to try to bring it directly to the floor, which is a motion. We call it smoking the bill out. There's different ways to phrase it, but that's what I've always called it. And we brought that over in the Senate. We had a plan to do that, and that passed by 3 votes. So even though it failed in committee, we brought it to the floor, and that's when things started getting interesting, because they were very concerned. And down there in Cheyenne, there's a coalition that is very similar to the coalition that you watch nationally doing damage to our grassroots conservative work. It's the coalition of the insiders. I call them insiders. You can call them rhinos, you can call them uniparty, whatever you want to call them. I prefer insiders because I think that's actually the most descriptive of what they are. There's this group of lobbyists and the moneyed interests that fund their campaigns, that they're beholden to, and I think that sort of Cheyenne, and it's not a product of Cheyenne. There's a lot of conservatives down there. There are. But it's more a product of that being the seat of government and all of the influence that wields. And they're the first part of that coalition. The second part is the Democrats, which maybe aren't a huge part of the legislature in numbers, but they pack a punch, believe it or not. Those 8 members there have a lot of power because the insiders coalesce with them to stop the conservatives, who granted don't have a majority of the whole House chamber, but have almost a majority. So they need their votes in order to stop stuff. And so they work with them. And then the third part of their coalition is the media. And when I mainly mean the Red Star and that Tribune Eagle. And they set the tone on the media tone on what is put out there. Now the Cowboy State Daily, depending on the day, they're kind of schizophrenic all over the place. But that's really their coalition. And they started bringing this argument when we were about to bring this bill through that, well, it would prevent new voters, whether it was somebody turning 18 or somebody that had moved here from out of state and had established residency, that it would prevent new voters from being able to affiliate after the cutoff deadline, which was the day before the beginning of the filing period, so about May 15th. And it's an absurd argument. And we were able to stop it in the Senate, even though it passed originally to change that, which would have required moving it back to the House. And we were worried that it wouldn't come back that you wouldn't have a concurrence vote. We were able to stop that. And then at the very end, the Attorney General started trying to push this narrative for a veto. And in a last-minute meeting, the day the governor had to make the decision, we had a meeting with them, and they were pushing their argument, and we pushed ours. Joe wrote the memo of a lifetime, I'm going to call it. I mean, he was working. We outlined it the day before, and he worked on it till about 2, 3 a.m. I was getting drafts there till pretty late, and we were revising it up to the meeting there at 9:30, and we really obliterated their arguments. And by the end of it, we were unclear what was going to happen, but there was no way. We made clear in that meeting that if they vetoed it, that we were going to push back on these absurd legal arguments that were brought at the last minute. So we got the call. I got the call from the governor at about 8:30 p.m. He had till midnight to make the decision, and he said, well, I'm going to let it become law. Our founders were very, very prescient, the writers of the state constitution, which they would not allow a pocket veto, unlike our federal constitution, which is also an inspired document. But one thing there that has been exploited, right, is the pocket veto. And our founders said, no, we're not going to allow pocket veto. The governor either has to veto the bill, sign it, or it becomes law without his signature after a certain period of time. So we were able to get that through. The governor allowed it through without his signature, but it doesn't matter because it is the law of the land effective July 1st, and crossover voting has ended in the state of Wyoming. That was our number one priority, and very happy that was brought through. The other thing we did was strengthening our voter ID bill. As we talked about earlier, voter ID is very near and dear to my heart as the lead on that bill in 2021, but there was a loophole that was exploited, which was in-person voting that had a nexus in person. There was this interpretation that absentee voting that had an in-person nexus would not require a voter ID. And over time, we want to expand it to absentee balloting. That's one of our big priorities moving forward. But this loophole that in-person absentee voting, an absentee ballot that was initiated in person would not require an ID, was certainly not in spirit with the plain meaning of the statute. You could argue that the way it was drafted maybe allowed it. But we wanted to clear up that loophole because it was a big problem in some counties. Some interpreted that absentee voting initiated in person would require an ID. Some said it didn't. Our previous SOS wasn't very helpful on that. If we had not gotten this cleared up, I would have issued some guidance on it. But we got it cleared up in statute. Chris Knapp brought a vehicle that we helped draft, and were able to bring that through the legislative process. The other thing we did was stop some bad bills. And of course, as grassroots conservatives, it's not just about passing good legislation, it's about stopping bad legislation. We were able to stop ranked choice voting, which is a very troubling trend across the nation, where they're trying to have this deal and Soros is pushing it. They've got a ballot initiative coming through Missouri, and this is their plan to take over a lot of red states. It's working up in Alaska, unfortunately. They passed a ranked choice voting initiative. It's why in a congressional race, you had a Democrat winning a congressional race in the state of Alaska. That's scary because of this ranked choice voting. One, none of the machines are certified to handle a ranked choice ballot. It just amazes me, the left, because they're always making fun of us for wanting to do hand counts. And then they're pushing this ranked choice thing. we talk to them about the fact there's no EAC certification on the machines, and they say, well, on that, we'll do a hand count. You let us have this. This is the way they are. But on that, we'll allow a hand count if you give us everything we want on the method of balloting. Just shows how that lack of sincerity and that constant triangulating that this insider group does. The other problem with it is that there's tabulation errors. New York City has this ranked choice voting. There was a tabulation error that they claim they sorted out. They were changing counts in the middle of the night. And granted, this was 3 weeks after the election night, because this is the other deal. It takes weeks to do the count. So who knows what's going on there. This ranked choice, and the other thing too is it takes, you have 20 races with 5 or 6 candidates in each race. It's going to take you an hour to do the ballot, if you have to rank every single one. So what happens, a lot of people don't do the entire ranking. What that leads to is something called ballot exhaustion, where if you haven't ranked all the candidates and all the candidates you have ranked are eliminated, then your ballot doesn't count, which dilutes the vote of the conservative base, which I'm afraid might be part of the intent of the bill. It's a very troubling trend, and we were able to stop it in the state legislature there in the Corporations Committee. The other bill we were able to stop is the attack on the state party and on county parties. They wanted to take away the ability for county parties to be able to fill vacancies and the state party to be able to fill vacancies. They're very upset about the fact that Superintendent Schrader was elected through that vacancy process, that you can go back in time to other folks that were elected in that vacancy process. They don't like it, even though in the past, when they controlled the party mechanisms, it was in their favor. So they didn't say anything when Barrasso was elected in that process. They didn't say anything when Ed Buchanan was elected in that process. When Gordon, after losing for Congress in 2008, was elected treasurer through that process. They didn't say anything about it then because they controlled the state party mechanism. But when conservatives took it back in 2017 and 2018, then all of a sudden they started chirping about this and saying, well, we need to take away the ability for county parties and state parties. And of course, you remember in the whole Alan Slagle, J.D. Williams deal, I mean, you remember that whole process, and fortunately that didn't. By the way, isn't Representative Slagle doing a great job?
No.
I admire Representative Slagle a great deal. Solid voting. We're going to talk about a veto that the governor did on one of the bills. We were pushing very, very diligently, and he, of course, worked on that wind bill, which, while it didn't come through our office at all, I'm very supportive of what he was trying to do to stop the abuse of landowners across our state, although it has been particularly apparent here in Weston and Niobrara counties. The other bill that we stopped that bill, that attack on the state and county parties' vacancy process on a 2-7 vote. The other bill we were able to stop was House Bill 6, which would have taken away any ability to have a hand count of the ballots. Whether, if you look at the implications of the bill, that's what it would have done. And it would have done that permanently, I'm afraid, unless it were repealed in the future. I was very concerned this was going to go through. We were able to stop that. So we were talking about this earlier. We still have the ability to have those pilot recounts and bring that through our county commissions. And I know the Weston County Commission is very strong and very excited about some of the developments there. Now, one of the bills that the governor vetoed, which I was very disappointed with, was Senate File 131. You remember when Liz Cheney sent out those absentee ballot request forms where she was impersonating the county clerks and saying, send in your absentee ballots, and very inappropriate. It's one of the things that Soros and his band of leftists are trying to do, which is drive up turnout in areas where they think it's going to benefit them. They're very good at doing this with these absentee ballot request forms. We had a bill that Senator Hutchings brought to ban this practice, brought it through. It was weakened over in the Senate. It basically didn't do anything. We asked for some changes in the House. The Freedom Caucus brought an amendment on third reading, and we brought that through where it actually did something, the statute. So then it gets sent to the governor's desk with this change, and he decides to veto the bill. I mean, in my opinion, I don't like legislation that is meaningless. Either you're going to fix the issue with a clear-cut bill or you're not. And our language clearly said that you could not have these request forms. You could say, hey, here's where to go to request an absentee ballot, but if you weren't an elections official, it's inappropriate to send out an official form. And he didn't like that. He said, well, we wanted the watered-down version that, in our opinion, didn't do much, and unfortunately vetoed the bill. I think that's too bad, and we're going to continue to work to bring through a strong bill through the legislature. The other thing we did on the elections end was pass House Bill 5, which one of the first things I asked Joe Rubino, our counsel, to do is look into something Ed Buchanan changed in the last year of his term, which was to refuse to release to the public the absentee ballot status on votes, and also what's called the voter ID number, which is a number that is assigned that ensures that there isn't double voting happening. In the election integrity community, you run a cross-check on this number, and it helps to ensure that there isn't double voting across jurisdictional lines, whether it's county or state. And if you looked at the plain meaning of the statute, while it was somewhat ambiguous, it certainly leaned towards the having this disclosed, and that was the practice for 20 years before Ed changed it. So we decided that the statute and certainly the legislative intent, if you look at the changes over time, allowed that, and we made that change administratively, and then we also brought a bill through the legislature to codify that in state statute, make it very clear so it, I won't be there forever, so a future Secretary of State couldn't change it back, and that was approved. That's a little bit of what we worked on elections. We had a very successful session. We also hired an entirely new elections division. We have Dusty Shryak is coming in as our election record specialist. Paul Raines is our assistant director of elections, and we just hired an election director that we're going to be introducing next week in the Joint Corporations Committee, which has jurisdiction over elections, and they're having their first meeting up in Lander a week from tomorrow. In our business division, we're up 20% year to year. Of course, the Red Star Tribune won't print this. Media won't print this. They said that everything was going to burn down after January 2nd when we got sworn in. We're up over 20% in our business division. We're continuing to work on banning drop boxes. We have a plan to do that. We also have an anti-ESG rule that we just released. We're bringing that through the rulemaking process, and if that becomes an official rule, that'll be the first anti-ESG action in Wyoming history that has the effect of law. And for those that, I know the acronym's a little confusing, this ESG movement, the social credit score, it comes out of China, the social credit score stuff, and the way the left is using it in the United States, they want to prevent capital from flowing to all the industries that are core industries in our state: coal, oil, gas, ag. And it's an attempt by Wall Street to basically continue to prevent us from reaching our full potential here. So we're very troubled. And one of the things we do in our office is we regulate securities advisors, stockbrokers, broker-dealers. That's one of the duties we have in the Secretary of State's office. We're very concerned that some of those advisors may back down to this woke mob pushing this and try to sell this to Wyoming clients without disclosure. So what we're requiring in this rulemaking is that they're going to have to disclose that this is not profit maximizing behavior, which is what they're supposed to be doing for the clients, for you, the citizens of Wyoming, when you contract with them to manage your money. And they're going to have to disclose that if they're not doing that, and tell you that they're pushing one of these woke clown show ESG products. And it is a woke clown show. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. We said that in one of the things that I do as Secretary of State. It's a constitutional duty, as I sit on the State Loan and Investment Board and the State Board of Land Commissioners, as well as the State Building Commission. The State Loan and Investment Board has oversight over our state investments. We manage over $20 billion. I was talking with a former state employee that is in the retirement system, and you look at our permanent funds, which are over $10 billion, and you add on the retirement funds, which by the time you're done, it's over $20 billion that the state of Wyoming has that we invest in a variety of ways. And I will not approve any investment advisor that does not denounce that woke clown show. And as soon as we said that, State Treasurer came out with a proposed policy change, which has to go through the full board next month to finally say that, and I want to strengthen it a little bit. It's a little weak for my taste, but saying that we're no longer agnostic on this, which was the previous position. So that leadership is already changing things on that board, and I think that's a positive development as well. We're moving into the interim, as Representative Slagle said. The interim is sort of the period, what a lot of people that try to get the job done in state government. The interim is the period between the end of the session and the beginning of the next one. So I know it's thrown around a lot. Just want to kind of make it clear what that is. And every committee of jurisdiction has usually 3 to 4 meetings during that period. The Joint Corporations, Elections, Political Subdivisions Committee, it's a long name, but they have the jurisdiction over elections. And we're going to be working on a number of items there starting next Tuesday in Lander for their first meeting. One is putting in state statute a clear residency requirement. Our Constitution, and I know I'm looking at Dan there, we have aficionados of our wonderful state Constitution. And if you're down in Cheyenne, please text or call me. I'd love to sit down with you, show you around our office in the state capitol. Every time I get into my office, I have just this incredible view of the chamber where they signed the state Constitution. It's so humbling every morning I get there to be able to have that straight shot view. And I think about it when I get in the office. And I tell our staff every day, every day is 0.07% of our 4-year term. So every day we got to at least have a 3-yard run up the middle. At least that. And you know how it goes. You have 3 3-yard runs up the middle. You got 4th and 1. You go for it. You make it 80% of the time. That opens up, and it also opens up the full field of play for 20-yard passes, 30-yard passes, and that's one of the things as Secretary of State that I'm working on is what are those different, in all the duties we have, whether it's elections, business, all the business filings we do on behalf of the state. The compliance division we talked about earlier on our work regulating mutual funds and mutual fund advisors, stockbrokers, broker-dealers. What are the different things we can do to advance what the citizens of Wyoming want on any level, whether it's a 10-yard pass or a 20-yard pass or just a 3-yard run up the middle? Good service. That is something I've been emphasizing. Being positive, emphasizing that with our staff, and we've been getting a lot of compliments, I think. And please let me know if you're filing an entity or an annual report in our business division. Please let me know what you think of our service. If it's good, and if there is unfortunately something that isn't good, please tell me. I want to know. I don't want to just know the positive stuff, because we need to improve. That's the other thing I try to emphasize with our staff is constant improvement. And I've never seen, one of the things that I want to bring to this office, that I've been troubled in the election space. When we brought the voter ID bill, we were attacked. The media attacked us for trying to improve something. They say that we're election deniers. They throw around all these different terms. And I really haven't seen that in other issue spaces. It's really in this election space. To me, this is about improvement, constant improvement. And the way the media attacks us for trying to improve things is very troubling. And we need to fight that every day, because when they attack us on that, and if we give in, that's what opens us up to attacks in the future. Whether it's pushing back on that transgender agenda, this very troubling transgender thing that the woke mob is trying to push, attacking our elections. We need to focus on improvement. And one of the deals that we're very troubled by, in our state constitution, we have a wonderful provision that says that you need to live here a year in order to vote. It's a residency requirement. And in 1972, the Supreme Court struck that down. The legislature in that interim has declined to act. So we have no residency requirement basically in Wyoming is what that means. It's very scary. It's a huge hole in our statutes. And we must close it. We're going to work to bring that through. We have a plan to get it done. That's going to be a huge priority for us. The other thing we want to do is ban the Zuck bucks, the Soros bucks, the third-party interference in our elections. 25 states have done that. Wyoming has yet to do it. We had a bill to try to get that done. Unfortunately, it wasn't referred to committee. That's another key priority for us. And also, one of our medium-term priorities is trying to get signature verification. That's something else that we're working on. Oh, one other thing before we go to Q&A. I know this has been a little long. So those that were here on August 2nd, you'll remember at the pizza bar, and we had an event. I was kind of dazed on the way up because I think I mentioned it, it was more at the end. I got a call on the way up here, and everybody was saying we were in good shape, and I told them, no, that Red Star Tribune will do something in the last 2 weeks. You wait. These people are sadistic. Yeah. So I get a call up. It is exactly 2 weeks before the day of the election. It's August 2nd. And of course, it's the day before the Wednesday paper, which is one of their marquee days. Of course, it's usually Sunday and Wednesday, right? But Sunday, they usually lead with a feature. So if they're going to plan a negative story against the conservative, a news item, news in quotes, they usually do it on the Wednesday. So I get a call at about 3:30 from this psycho reporter, and she says, oh, by the way, have you seen this complaint that has been filed by Max Maxfield? He's a former Secretary of State, but he's a total insider. And have you seen this complaint that's been filed against you? And my answer was the truth. No, because these complaints are sealed, because they know at the federal level that they can become weapons used. Anybody can file a complaint, so they can become election weapons. But he leaked it to this paper. And they refused to send it to me, and they said, I'm on my way to Newcastle. You know how it is from Casper, services in and out. They go, well, you have 30 minutes to respond, and we're not going to send you the complaint. So anyway, that's what ended up on the top of the fold Wednesday paper 2 weeks before the election, which then my opponent then put in mailers, because that's the name of the game. They get it in the paper, so then they have a citation that they can cite in a mailer. It was totally bogus. It accused me of taking straw donations. I would never do that. It was dismissed on a unanimous vote about a month ago on the bipartisan FEC committee there in D.C. And then they refused to put the correction above the fold. It was, below the fold, of course. So that is one of the, I want to end with that, because that's one of the tactics, this coalition of the insiders, Max Maxfield, the Democrats who pushed out the story, the media that pushed out the story on behalf of the insiders. That's one of the tactics they use, and we must push back on it. We cannot allow these actors to try to cancel conservative grassroots members that are getting the job done, whether it's the Freedom Caucus, working on property tax, and I'd love in the Q&A to talk a little about property tax and caps. We have to push back on that coalition, because that is what is preventing us from being able to reach our full potential as a state. Thank you. Well, can I talk about property tax for a few minutes?
You may.
One other thing, too, there's a sign-in sheet at the back. We do emails, so if we have email updates. If you're interested, if you could fill out that sign-in sheet, would appreciate it. Had that point earlier about property tax, and when I was in the legislature during 2020, during COVID, I represented East Casper, Natrona County. We started seeing tremendous growth. that was not backed up by the assessments. So in 2021, I asked to be on the revenue committee and filed a bill in 2021, which was a cap. It was a 3% cap, which I've looked back since 2010. It had never been brought a cap. Said, it's time that we start thinking about this issue. And asked to be on the committee to help bring that through the legislature. We get to the revenue committee, and it was 2021. Amazingly, the legislature, the leadership refused to have us meet in person for the first part of the session. So it was over Zoom, the meeting on this cap bill. And they said by the end, this is only a Natrona and Teton problem, Chuck. That's what they said on that. These insiders, they're wrong constantly. And they're never held to account by the media. It's very troubling to me. And they even in 2022 were saying, this is only a Natrona and Teton problem, Chuck. And every year since then, we've seen this tremendous growth in across our state. There is a little bit of a divide in the conservative movement. I won't quite, I think divide's a little bit too far, but whether to have a cap or move to acquisition value, which is when you basically pay what your assessment is what you paid for the home. We can have a combination of the two, which is to have a year-to-year cap on the growth based on that valuation being what you paid on the home. The problem, I would say, with just doing a cap is there's been this tremendous growth already. So how do you roll that back? That's one of the problems. But I still think a 3% cap is at least part of the solution. There's a whole debate about whether you need a constitutional amendment or not to do the cap. I can make the argument that you don't. Do I think with the current makeup of the Supreme Court it'll pass judicial muster? Probably not. And I'm just being honest with you. I think my argument is correct, but because it basically says there, it says in the Constitution that, you'll have assessments, and then it says, comma, as defined by the legislature. Well, my argument is, look, if the legislature says that an assessment should have a cap, that's our definition of what a fair value assessment is. But with the current makeup, it would probably be struck down. So that means you need a constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of both chambers and then a vote of the people. And I'm not worried about the vote of the people, but the challenge is getting that 2/3 and getting it into a statutory, a constitutional vehicle that can be brought through the whole process. So one of the last meetings I had as a legislator was in late 2022, it was in mid-December. The insiders have been wanting to bring this approach, and ultimately it went through, where they're going to break out residential as a new classification for property tax purposes. And then they say after that passes, then they're going to pass a 15 to 20% reduction. They're going to lower the assessment ratio on residential, which if they do it at the max amount allowed would probably reduce everybody's 15 to 20%. And it would just be for the residential, not commercial. That's what they say they're going to do. So when they brought this approach, we had this idea to use that amendment to add in a section allowing for caps. Because every time we've brought this statute, and we've tried it now since 2021, 3 times, they say, well, it's not constitutional. And we, through a miracle, brought that through the Revenue Committee. It was my last meeting in the legislature by 1 vote as a committee bill. But then within 1 week of it getting filed, there was another constitutional amendment brought that was filed as a bill that had everything that the Revenue Committee passed minus the cap language, which was 1 sentence. It just said cap shall be allowed. So it was very clear. It said it in legalese, but that's what it meant. So we wouldn't have to have this constitutional argument. We can just bring a statute through, or if that didn't work, just have an initiative, because the people of Wyoming want this. You could get the signatures in probably a month, and it would pass with probably 90% of the vote, maybe even higher. And as Representative Slagle said, they tried to add this to the amendment that was brought twice after the vehicle they decided to bring through took the language out. We worked with Representative Locke to bring that to the floor. I talked with him quite a bit, and it failed twice. So what they ended up getting was that constitutional amendment which breaks out residential property tax. You'll see it on your ballot next year, which then in theory, if that passes, which it probably will, the legislature will be able to come back in 2025 to lower the assessment ratio, but it's within a certain band. The Constitution says that I believe it can only be, I think it's 20% lower than the other classifications. So in theory, that would mean they could lower it to like 7.5, which would lower your bill like 20%. But it would be after all the increases you've had. Your assessment would remain the same. It would be the assessment ratio by which it was multiplied by. So that's what the medium term looks like on this. In the long term, I think we need to bring through that cap language, and I think we should try to do it as a statute. That's what I would do. Yes.
What are the arguments against the acquisition price, basing it on what he paid? What's the argument against that? That sounds perfect.
Mm-hmm. There's a few arguments.
Oh, is there?
Some of which I don't agree with, some of which I think we do need to be careful about. Okay, I'm not saying I'm fine with acquisition value, but it needs to be written the right way, or else it's actually going to raise many people's taxes. I guess there are many people whose assessments are below what they paid. Now, you can argue that's their fault. I think that if you have an acquisition value mechanism, it should basically be it should be people that know they're purchasing it after a certain point. So it should be after it's passed, everybody that purchases from then on. Everybody else, you could have a cap, basically locking in their value with a 3% kicker or whatever the inflationary kicker is. Or you could do it the other way and just lock everybody in from what they paid. I think there are implications on that. It would raise many people's property taxes. Establishing that, it's complex for people that have owned their properties for a long time. I mean, that's a little bit of a complexity. But the way you draft it to fix that is you just have it from the point of passage, and everybody else, you sort of move back in time is the way the amendment would be drafted. You could put everybody else's property taxes from what their 2017 or 2018 value was before we started seeing the tremendous growth, and then add in a 3% kicker or whatever the percentage kicker would be. That's part of it. The other argument is what happens in a collapse, if it does happen, in a housing collapse. Not so much a hyperinflation, which might happen as well, but what do you do in that environment? If somebody's property dropped 40% and they're paying off what they paid, is that fair?
Yeah.
Probably not. Now that's a hypothetical that, well, might happen.
It's about the same as what's happening now, though. You're paying on ungained profit, unrealized gains when your neighbor buys his place for $2 million next to yours that you paid a couple $100,000 for, and then you have to pay taxes like he's paying. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was just answering the question on what the arguments are for. I'm not opposed to it. I'm for it. I think it has to be drafted correctly. I also think that the cap is easier to bring through, but the problem now with the cap, as I was talking about, is you've had 5 years of growth and it's just going to keep going.
Yeah.
So does it really fix it? No. You'd have to have that combo. I think no matter what you do, whether it's acquisition or the cap, you have to roll it back to a certain point in time and then have an inflationary kicker. Yes.
So there's no chance of going back to the assessed value versus the fair market?
You could do that as well. You could do that as well. Change it back from 88. And Cindy is very into that. She talks a lot about that approach. I think it's great you're going to have Cindy, and I just saw her on Saturday. We had a town hall up in Buffalo. She's a great person, stellar person. I think that's going to be a great event. I'd like to come to that.
You're invited.
Yeah. Anything else? I know it was a little long here. Thanks for hanging in there with me. We got a lot done in 5 months. Got a lot done in 5 months.
Way to start.
All right. No further questions from the crowd? Well, thank you very much, Chuck, for coming out. We really appreciate you very much. And also, if you all have a minute to get to know Jesse Rubino, Joe Rubino, where did he go? Joe is Chuck's right hand, as he said, and he is just a wonderful person.
Marvelous person.
And you won't be sorry. You get to know him as well. So,
Can I
Dan.
have one last question?
Yes.
He's right there. A couple months ago, I sent you that deal about that bank up there in North Dakota.
Uh-huh.
What did you think of that article?
Dan's talking about a state bank on a North Dakota model. Well, on this ESG stuff, I don't trust the banks anymore. I think you see these collapses of Silicon Valley Bank. It was all driven by this ESG woke agenda. They're not profit maximizing. They spend so much time focused on how they're going to label a bathroom for their, this is the other thing. I mean, it's unbelievable the governor, after we brought through the bill stopping the boys from participating in girls' sports, he won't even sign that bill. I mean, he allowed it to become law. And, we need that leadership on things like that. Thank you. And this woke agenda. Anyway, back to your question. It's been talked about for some time. Bob Ide, who's one of my mentors, he's a state senator now. He's very into it. Very into that. There's some that are more free market conservatives, right? Lower government, that say, well, is that too much government? That's the argument from the conservative side, some concern. But with where we're going, it is something we need to look at, because the free market isn't free when they're trying to push their woke agenda, when they're trying to debank coal, oil, gas, ag. That's not the free market. It's not. And we can't allow it to continue. So if they have some competition, there's an argument that you'll get some improvement there. I think there's some legs on it, but on the other hand, we need to think about what it means to be a conservative, and how do we reconcile the fact that we do believe in less government with that approach. And I'm not saying it can't be. And we have to also be reactive to what we're facing with movements in these banks. But that's the tension, the challenge, I think, there. But
I just want the federal government out of it. That's,
right.
The main thing. It doesn't need to be FDIC, insured.
Well, that's the other thing. They're trying to push their digital currency from China. I mean, that thing is very troubling. So I think there's a lot of legs on it. Bob Ide really believes in it. I want to keep learning more. I want to reach out to some folks in North Dakota to understand it a little more. What do you think?
I'm all for it.
Would it give us protection from the central bank digital?
I mean, it's more lending what you're doing out of there. I mean, they still print dollars. I mean, it wouldn't be able to print a currency unless the state gave it that authority. But then, how is that backed? It doesn't, unless you establish it. It's just a piece of paper. You have to. Yes.
Loretta and me listened to a news article here over the weekend, and whether it's completely factual or not, I don't know. But after January 6th, the FBI asked, maybe more than just the Bank of America, but they asked the Bank of America to help them out on what might have taken place. And they give them some criteria that if you had bought a gun in the last 2 years, that helped you get on the top of the list. If you used your credit card in the Washington, D.C. area during somewhere before January 6th, that got you on the list. No subpoena, no nothing.
Yes, very troubling. And
That
that's
is-
another
that-
reason why we need to look at this. I know one of the attorneys that filed a lawsuit on behalf of some of the citizens wronged by B of A on that action. And it is totally inconsistent with the laws of this nation and totally inconsistent with our values. And I would encourage everybody to pull your money out of B of A. But unfortunately, I'm not sure necessarily where to put it, because I'm not sure I trust many of these institutions to really push back on it. But granted, they're all on a spectrum, and B of A is either the worst or among the worst. And I would say the worst based on that one action. Wells is pretty bad too. I don't.
Yeah.
I got a question on
Yes.
the one in North Dakota there. Isn't that a sovereign bank up there though?
It's backed by the state. Yep.
So
The state's a sovereign. Yeah.
could they, could we do that here and kind of bypass their ESG stuff and make them, or not make them, but have them give loans to like coal?
Yes. Yes. That would be the upside. Would be the
You
lending
know, take
authority
that COVID
that
money
you
and
could
put
have on
that
that. You
in
could
there.
basically bypass all the woke stuff and provide capital to industries that the left doesn't want, but are pivotal to our state.
And ranchers.
Yes. Well, they're going after ag now. I mean, I don't have to tell you,
We may have to form our own country here.
Some people think we already have.
Yeah.
I know it's been a really long day, and I'm sorry, but
Yes, I know.
I'll be here till midnight.
do we
I'll be
have
here.
any reason why Summers wouldn't let that one out of the drawer to get our gold and silver back?
That was brought.
dollars were more than gold.
That was brought by Bob Ide, that bill. Which one? I think you're talking about the Ide bill, which did go through, but it was so watered down it didn't do anything. And then the Freedom Caucus.
The gold mine, and I'm not mine, but the gold bank.
It
Yeah.
went through, but they.
Yeah, it was so
it
watered
died.
down it didn't
was
do
bad.
anything. It went through the Senate, then the House. It was a little watered down in the Senate. Bob Ide brought it, so it originated over in the Senate. Then it went over the House, went to the Revenue Committee. Was basically it did nothing. I mean, every shall was moved to May, which doesn't do anything because in May is basically the status quo. So it was then in the House, the Freedom Caucus tried to bring a number of amendments strengthening. I think they called a roll call vote on that. That failed by a few votes, and then they decided to vote it down, which it gets back to our discussion earlier. If it's a meaningless statute, we can't let the insiders get away with that. It's one of the favorite tactics of the insiders is to water down a bill to the point where it doesn't do anything. Very similar to what they're doing with the property tax. I mean, you could argue the breakout does something, but it's very minimal. And then, of course, they push this refund program and say they're doing all this stuff. Last week, the Department of Revenue sending out all these press releases when most people don't qualify for it. And we can't let the insiders get away with those shenanigans, that tactic. I'll be here.
All right.
Thank you.